This world, the material world, is murky and dreamlike. That world is sharp, crisp, alive, meaningful, powerful, detailed. The memories of things that occur there will last a century or more. I mean, it's amazing the kind of power of this kind of adventure. That is something that's unforgettable. That's why near-death experiencers come back from this kind of experience never fearing death at all, because they realize it's only a transition into a higher level of existence. And it's part of an ongoing oscillatory pathway that we follow that involves reincarnation, coming back into physical bodies and living again. And I didn't realize yet the tremendous scientific evidence supporting the reality of reincarnation. And yet that's what was shown to me very powerfully on this particular journey. But now everything mattered because there was another soul out there that needed me. And so it was really my love for bond that compelled me to come back to this world.
Welcome, everyone, to our sliver of time. Today we have Dr. Eben Alexander, who is a world-famous neurosurgeon who had a near-death experience. And today we're going to get into his story and pick his brain about reincarnation, consciousness, and a whole list of topics. Dr. Eben Alexander, thank you so much for coming on.
Well, Dave, thanks so much for having me on. It's a great pleasure to be with you this evening and look forward to our conversation.
Absolutely. What kind of led to this near-death experience in the first
Okay.
place?
Very important to point out. Yeah, I'd grown up in a neurosurgical family. My father was a globally renowned neurosurgeon. It turns out I was adopted into that family. I didn't meet my birth family until I was 54 years old, well into this story that we'll be talking about tonight. But my father had been very influential to me. He obviously was very much a scientist. He ran a neurosurgical training program. He was very versed in physics and cosmology and science in general. And yet, for him, he had grown up the son of a general surgeon in Eastern Tennessee who took him to the Presbyterian church every Sunday of his life. So my dad had a very strong belief in God and the power of prayer. Now, for example, he was a combat surgeon in the Second World War, spent over 2 years in the Pacific Theater. I still have at my bedside his little pocket Bible of the Psalms and New Testament that he carried with him during those 2 years. And I think that's a big part of why he came back from that war relatively unscathed, because he always knew that prayer worked and he used it in his work as a surgeon, et cetera. Like many who grew up in the 60s and 70s, like I did, I always knew science was the pathway to truth. And I made a big mistake early on that is the mistake of so many in our society. And that is thinking that science in some way conflicts with spirituality. That's where my dad had it perfectly right. He knew that rich, powerful, effective spirituality, prayer, etc., could be associated with a very modern scientific mindset. To him, there was no worry. And for me, I had to learn a lesson, and I learned it through my near-death experience, because I had become a card-toting, reductive materialist neurosurgeon up until the time of my coma. That was in November 10th of 2008, when I woke up at age 54 with severe back pain, severe headache. Soon thereafter, grand mal seizures, lapsed into coma. My family was very concerned, called the ambulance to our home. They took me away deep in coma. There's a myth out there that was perpetrated by a writer who was trying to take away my credibility, who claimed that this was a medically induced coma. He couldn't be further from the truth. This coma was induced by the severe case of E. coli bacterial meningoencephalitis. And that's why it's so important to the medical community. And in fact, there's a medical case report on my medical records that greatly validates and strengthens all the story I put out there in Proof of Heaven, and confirms just how damaged my brain was. And in fact, in that article, it was in Journal of Nervous and Mental Disease, September 2018, they made it clear my brain was in no shape to harbor any kind of dream or hallucination, much less this most extraordinary spiritual journey that I ended up having. And that's why some of my greatest support over the last 15 years in this journey of discovery and unraveling my near-death experience, making sense of it in a scientific fashion, has been the scientific community. Now, to get into my story, and I'm not going to take a lot of time on it because I want plenty of time for your questions, but it's important to point out that my near-death experience had one really atypical feature. Every NDE is tailored for the individual soul who has it, period. There's no other reason for their existence. And mine was tailored for a neurosurgeon who had deep questions about brain-mind connection, the nature of reality, etc. And that's why this amnesia was so important. And of course, I also subscribe to the classical teaching before my coma that memories are somehow stored in the brain. And yet my coma journey showed me very clearly, no, 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 memories are not stored in the brain at all. The brain allows access to consciousness and access to memory, but it's not the ultimate producer or repository of either one of those processes. We talk about all that in great detail in that third book, Living in a Mindful Universe. In this setting of complete amnesia and no knowledge of humanity in this universe, that's how my experience started. It was an empty slate, which I think was absolutely critical for me to get the deepest lessons that have come to light over the 15 years since my coma. So in that amnesic state, I was in what I call the earthworm eye view, a very primitive, coarse, kind of unresponsive realm, like being in dirty jello. I have strong memories of roots or blood vessels all around me. The good news is I wasn't there forever, even though it seemed like a long time. I was rescued by a slowly spinning pure white light with fine silvery and golden tendrils around it. And it came spinning slowly towards me out of that murky darkness. And it opened up like a rip in the fabric of that ugly earthworm eye view realm and led up into this brilliant, ultra real gateway valley. Now, a huge mistake many people make is thinking an NDE would be murky and dreamlike. No, the exact opposite. This world, the material world, is murky and dreamlike. That world is sharp, crisp, alive, meaningful, powerful, detailed. The memories of things that occur there will last a century or more. I mean, it's amazing the kind of power of this kind of adventure. And it's one thing that if you haven't had it, you really can't appreciate. But an extraordinary ultra reality. That's what I experienced in that Gateway Valley. I was a speck of awareness on a butterfly wing. There were millions of other butterflies looping and spiraling in vast formations. And it turns out I wasn't alone. There was a beautiful young woman beside me, and anybody who's read the book Proof of Heaven will realize how important she was. Her sparkling blue eyes, high cheekbone, high forehead, broad smile. She never said a word to me. She never had to. But her message, you are deeply loved and cherished forever. You have nothing to fear. You are richly cared for, was very validating, reassuring. It reminded me I was in a spiritual home. This place was familiar and becoming more so by the second. So in that setting, in that Gateway Valley, below us in the meadow, beautiful, perfect meadow, no sign of any death or decay, blossoms, buds on trees, flowers, opening up in these beautiful, dynamic, rich display of living bliss. I mean, it was the whole world was alive. This was kind of like Plato's world of ideals, but for the individual soul. And I remember we witnessed thousands of beings down in the meadow below dancing, joy and merriment. I recall children playing, dogs jumping, incredible festivities, all being fueled because up above were these swooping orbs of angelic choirs that were emanating chants and anthems, hymns that would just thunder through my awareness and enliven this entire scene. There were sparkling waterfalls into crystal blue pools, and of all these thousands of beings dancing in that lovely meadow down below. I called them in my later writings, weeks later, when I woke up and was trying to record all this. I said there were souls between lives. And that was kind of my general feeling, this rich, kind of beautiful afterlife experience that I was seeing, a liberation of consciousness. The last thing I expected, as a materialist neurosurgeon thinking brain creates consciousness, would be to have this extraordinary kind of awareness and awakening going on. It turns out that was just a stepping stone. As I said, I call that the Gateway Valley. And I remember all those angelic choirs above, emanating chants and anthems, hymns. Those were what were fueling this incredible festivity and mirth. They also resulted in yet another musical portal. Just like I'd been led up from that earthworm eye view up into the Gateway Valley by a lovely light portal of music, the same thing happened again. And I remember all of that four-dimensional space-time. I could sense that from that spiritual realm, the material realm collapsing down. And then all of that rich spiritual realm. And note that Gateway Valley, for example, would be where people would have life reviews. your life flashing before your eyes. And notice when they talk about that, it's of a timeless realm. I mean, a realm where you simultaneously can experience birth, death, every interval in between, everything that happened is simultaneously there. This is an entirely different realm from the one we're used to because of this deep time or meta time that allows for much richer connection of all the dots of our lives, all the events of our lives to make greater sense of our journey. And so what I was experiencing there was this tremendous kind of expansion and acknowledgement of the grandness of soul. And yet, given my amnesia, I could not have an Eben Alexander life review. But I did witness life reviews and reincarnation in very powerful fashion in some of the visions I had moving forward. From this Gateway Valley, as all of that deep time and that spiritual realm collapsed down until it was all in this complex oversphere, which I saw as basically the entire universe throughout all of eternity, as a teaching tool. And I was told in that realm, what I call the core realm, which I now ascended to from the Gateway Valley. And that realm to me was a complete resolution of all dualities. That's where, we live in a world where masculine, feminine, dark, light, good, evil, etc., all these different spectra of dualities of possibilities. But in that realm, in the core, it's the source of all that happens. And that is where one encounters that God force. And that is something that's unforgettable. That's why near-death experiencers come back from this kind of experience, never fearing death at all, because they realize it's only a transition into a higher level of existence. And it's part of an ongoing oscillatory pathway that we follow that involves reincarnation, coming back into physical bodies and living again. And I didn't realize yet the tremendous scientific evidence supporting the reality of reincarnation. And yet that's what was shown to me very powerfully on this particular journey. In the core realm, I was taught, we'll teach you many things, but you're not here to stay. You'll be going back. And one of those many lessons in these multiple passages through these realms, because I would cycle through them all. But in one of them, I had a vision that I call the flying fish vision in the core of the fish down in the waters like us down in these material bodies, temporarily dumbed down to the knowledge of the higher soul so that we have this buy-in to kind of our ego perspective of living this one life. And yet the more spiritually advanced we are, the more we know that this is only one of many incarnations we've had. And so in that vision, in the flying fish vision, of course, when we're up out of the water, that's between lives. That's when we go through life reviews, reunite with souls of departed loved ones, plan next incarnations, what are going to be the hardships and difficulties and challenges that actually are the gifts that allow for our growth. And then we dive back in and then have programmed forgetting, where most of us by age 6 or 7 have forgotten any past life memories. And yet the scientists who do this research, if you go to uvadops.org, you can learn about 6 decades plus of research into reincarnation by scientific groups. You start realizing that that program forgetting is built into the process, so that by 7 or 8, you don't remember those past lives or between lives. And that's how we kind of live these lives now. But that's kind of the state of humanity at our current level of evolution. But anyway, back to my NDE, I would tumble back down to that earthworm eye view, and it was by remembering the musical notes of the melody that I could conjure up the light portal to take me back up into the beautiful Gateway Valley, always welcomed there by that lovely guardian angel. And again, those who've read Proof of Heaven will realize that 4 months post-coma, it was discovering her identity that actually helped me to prove the reality of my journey. And then after her reassurances ascending through that light portal of the angelic choirs to higher levels, and on a much later passage through, there was an evolved version of that flying fish story that I call the Indra's Net vision, which was a very powerful vision of reincarnation and of soul journey, of the life reviews serving as kind of a course correction. And in this Indra's Net vision, I saw all these interwoven threads, which were the threads of our lives, with the weave and flow of those threads being almost like incarnation is an inhale, and then between lives is an exhale, and then that ebb and flow and every bit of that, but it was all going towards this golden center. So this is not the notion of reincarnation, for example, out of Buddhism, where you might be trying to get off the wheel of suffering. But the world of NDEs from all religions and all backgrounds supports more of a vision of love and of progress, of transformation that occurs with our souls in going through these multiple lifetimes and coming back and again in this process of growth towards oneness with the divine. So it's a far more sensible vision that I think is much more satisfying in terms of where we're headed, and that this is all about a shift in understanding of all of humanity for the nature of consciousness and reality. It's been a 5,000 year plus journey of discovery. Now, it turns out that in my NDE, there were many other lessons. Of course, we don't have time to go into every bit of that. But the reality is that there came a point where, as they told me the first time I entered the core, you're not here to stay, you'll be going back. And I'd come to believe that meant just going back to the earth from my view, which of course was not a big problem, because by remembering the musical notes of the melody, I could conjure up these light portals that led me up back into the spiritual realm. But they weren't kidding. And there did come a time when I tumbled back down to that earth from my view and trying to recall the musical notes of the melody and conjure up the light portal, it no longer worked. To say I was sad at that point would be an understatement, but I also knew that I could trust that I would be taken care of. And the next thing I remember was thousands of beings going off into the distance around me, many with heads bowed, some holding candles, this murmuring energy coming up from them. And what I called that, much weeks later when I wrote it all up, I said, that was the power of prayer. That's what I sensed, was these people were praying. And somehow that was kind of guiding me back towards this world. And then the last thing I saw in the NDE were the 6 faces that would bubble up out of the muck in this earthworm's eye view, say a few words that I couldn't understand because my amnesia was still very powerful. And then they'd go back into the muck. And that was that. I could remember them visually and the whole experience of their presence as sharply today as if the whole thing happened yesterday morning. And yet all this happened 15 years ago. And that was on day 7 of coma. It was a Sunday morning. That's when those 6 faces were so important to me, because 5 of them were physically present in the ICU room the last 24 to 48 hours I was in coma. So they basically showed me that the vast majority of the coma journey had to happen between days 1 and 4 or 1 and 5 of the 7-day meningitis coma. As I explain all the timing of that in Proof of Heaven and in the book, Living in a Mindful Universe. But it was really the 6th face that got my attention. And that was the face of a 10-year-old boy. And I didn't recognize him at the time, but it was my son, Bond. My amnesia was still very much in effect. That was Sunday morning, day 7 of coma. They'd had me on a ventilator on 3 powerful antibiotics all week long, but without any sign of neurologic improvement. They were saying it was time to let me go. And Bond had been protected from the worst news during that week, but he was not protected from that. He overheard this family doctor conference where they said I had gone from 10% chance of survival down to 2%, but with no chance of recovery. And that's why they recommended stopping antibiotics and just letting me go. And that's when Bond ran down the hallway, pulled open my eyelids. They were taped shut, one eye looking over there, one eye over there, neither pupil working. Anybody in medicine knows that's a horrible picture. And I promise you, I did not see him with my eyes or hear him with my ears. I was far too gone from this world. But is pleading with me, Daddy, going to be okay? Daddy, you're going to be okay. So if somehow that would make it so, it got through. And I didn't understand the words, but there was his pleading quality. And during this entire week in coma, through all these incredible adventures that I've been through, I'd always thought it can continue or cease, it doesn't matter. But now everything mattered because there was another soul out there that needed me. And so it was really my love for Bond that compelled me to come back to this world. And I think my higher soul and all the other forces I'd encountered through this journey were what ushered me back to this world. But when I first woke up on the ICU bed, a few hours after all that, and was fighting the ventilator, they pulled out the tube and I said, thank you. I didn't recognize my mother, my sisters, my sons, loved ones at the bedside. My amnesia was still in effect from the damage to my brain from this meningitis, and yet it was setting the stage for a much deeper set of lessons. That's what I was able to discern, in the coming weeks and months, trying to figure all this out. And in the 36 hours after I was extubated, I was in and out of a paranoid, delusional, psychotic nightmare. I'm glad I wrote it all down, because the memories of the deep coma experience are as sharp and vivid today as if they happened yesterday. Whereas the memories of that psychotic nightmare in the 36 hours after awakening from coma, those disappeared within weeks. So I'm glad I wrote it all down, but do not try and say that an NDE is simply an ICU psychosis. They are completely different entities by a long shot, no comparison whatsoever, given the detail of memories, the meaningful transformational power versus an ICU psychosis where it's just kind of crazy. And I knew even when it was happening that it was delusions, that it was not real, whereas the deep coma stuff was absolutely real. And so I've spent the 15 years since my coma working with scientists around the world, with other experiencers, thousands of people who have reached out to me about their own experiences. And this is what I'm carrying to the world today, is a message that this scientific revolution is well in process. And if you read our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, you'll see exactly where all this is headed, but through quantum physics, neuroscience, the hard problem of consciousness, philosophy of mind, the binding problem, non-local consciousness, telepathy, things like that, and NDEs, near-death experiences, shared death experiences, after-death communication. All of this material points to a much richer role of consciousness in the universe. And in fact, where the scientific world is headed on this is towards the primacy of consciousness, and that the physical world emerges from consciousness.
Thank you so much for sharing that story. And I think it's incredible that your son kind of played a role in getting you back. So that's kind of a beautiful, beautiful part of the story as well.
Well,
I
he,
have a
yeah,
bunch of questions.
all right. I was just going to add, my older son also played a tremendous role. He was there at my bedside during much of my coma, hand holding like the other family members were. I think that kept me attached to this world. But very importantly, my older son was majoring in neuroscience in college at the time I went into coma. And when he saw me in deep coma that first night, he knew I was in big trouble. But anyway, he ended up, after when I started recovering and went back to school, finished his exams, and then drove home a little early for Thanksgiving. He got home the day before Thanksgiving, back in 2008, drove overnight, surprised me at 6 a.m. He knew I was up all night because I couldn't sleep after my coma experience. I was so energized by the spiritual energy of it. I just couldn't sleep. And I was up writing and reading and all kinds of stuff. Anyway, he drove home, and the day before Thanksgiving, got there at 6 a.m., gave me a big hug. He told me later, it was like there was a light shining within me, and I was far more present than I'd ever been before. And I told him it was way too real to be real. But that's why he told me, he said, well, studying neuroscience, it was clear that every time you revisit a memory, you change it. So he told me, write everything down I could remember about my NDE before I read anyone else's NDEs. And I'd never paid much attention to that literature before anyway. So that was great advice. And so both of my sons ended up playing a tremendous role in my coming back from coma and then making better sense of it from a scientific perspective.
Some people talk about the like silver cord, if you will, like it's like a love connection. I don't
Uh,
know if you think of it as a silver cord, but that's what some people say. Like if that connection is there, that um, keeps you attached to, between the living and the dead, or I don't know. I kind of worded that very, very weird, but do you believe there's some sort of silver cord connection when
well,
it comes to like a
I've heard a lot of reference to that silver cord. In fact, in Map of Heaven, we even talk about people who visualize seeing that silver cord kind of connecting to the soul of a loved one during the dying process. I have not seen that myself with the silver cord, but I've certainly heard enough reports that I take that as a very serious concept in this whole literature.
Yeah, it seems like maybe there doesn't have to be like a physical, no pun intended, like a physical silver cord, but the attachment of the love itself, it seems to be very important. So who knows if that carries on through lifetimes, are we seeing the same souls in different lifetimes? I guess that's a whole other question, but
Well, I think our soul journey is definitely involved with soul groups. There's no such thing as an individual soul evolving or anything like that. So, and I think love is obviously the connector. That's the major force, as NDEers will tell you by the boatload. And more than 90% of near-death experiencers from all cultures, all belief systems, come back to this world believing in some kind of a unifying force of love at the core of the universe. Now, you can debate whether you want to call it God or Allah, Brahman, Vishnu, Jehovah, Yahweh, Great Spirit, et cetera, et cetera. But ultimately, NDEs kind of unify the way we should look at the afterlife, so that that presence and that force, that ambience in these experiences is one of love, of kindness and compassion that binds us all together. And it seems very much a rich spiritual home. That's one thing that amazed me about so many of the communications I got about all of this after my coma and my own experience, was it's a spiritual home that seems very familiar. It's like that program forgetting deletes a lot of information, but it's in our subconscious. So we always can have access to it. And that's why centering prayer and meditation for me are so important, to stress. You don't have to have an NDE, but by being a conscious sentient being, you have the power to explore your own consciousness through meditation and centering prayer. And that is what Karen and I, my partner and the co-author of the book, Living in a Mindful Universe, support very strongly in that book, his personal journeys. We help people with techniques, especially for meditation. Sacredacoustics.com is a very powerful form of binaural beat brainwave entrainment. And we explain in the book why that has been so effective, certainly for me. I use Sacred Acoustics daily for an hour or two. I've been doing that for more than 11 or 12 years now. Incredibly important to stress that by exploring our own consciousness, we can come to a lot of these same answers without needing a full bore, near-death experience.
I'm curious about this programmed forgetting. We come into these lives, we're programmed to forget what was on the other side. Because the science is starting to point in a particular direction, once you get into quantum physics, you see electrons in superposition and all logic kind of goes out the window. But my question to you is, if we come in here and we are programmed to forget so that we can focus on these lives, what do you think the world's going to look like when all of humanity knows the secrets, if you will, to the other side?
Well, I think what's happening is we're going through a natural process of evolution, and it's a process of coming into greater wisdom. And I think humanity, if you go back over 10 or 12,000 years, probably longer, depending on some research, but over those many millennia, we've kind of ebbed and flowed in terms of our kind of knowledge of the spiritual versus getting lost in the weeds of the material world. And in fact, and I know Karen is very versed in what are called the yugas, which is an idea that we were much closer to tremendous knowledge like 10,000 years ago, and yet we've entered this kind of dark period. And the dark period is one of where materialism holds sway. And what we're witnessing now, and anybody who's paying attention to quantum physics and what's happened to it in the last 100 years, will recognize that what you see is a very deep and profound science dedicated to the deepest understanding of the workings of this physical world around us, starts revealing that every bit of it depends on the mental, that the choices we make of how to observe things, et cetera, play a tremendous role. It's what John Wheeler, renowned quantum physicist at Princeton, called the participatory anthropic principle. But what he was pointing out is, don't pretend you can ignore the influence of the mind. That's the anthropic part of that principle, that mind and its influence on emerging reality. And it goes far beyond just, discerning various physical states of entities. But, the non-local consciousness, things like telepathy, have been very well demonstrated in a scientific setting. If you doubt that, read Guy Leon Playfair's book on twin telepathy, where he talks about 35% of identical twins having powerful telepathic experiences. And so this non-local consciousness, this shared sense of mind, is something that really comes into focus when you study NDEs, after-death communications, all kinds of things around the dying process. So it's not just near-death experiences, but for example, in the hospice literature, where you just have people who go on to die, they have the very same things happening, where loved ones, the souls of departed loved ones, are coming to escort them over. In fact, I've learned as a scientist that one of the greatest indicators that you have someone who is close to leaving the physical body is when they're witnessing loved ones who have left the physical plane come to welcome them over. That very thing happened in profound fashion to my own adoptive mother, who passed over at age 99 in April of 2019. And I was with her the last, say, day or so of her life. And it was just an amazing experience to go through. But she was basically comatose the last 4 days and nights of her life, except for 2 days before, 2 nights before, she woke up in the middle of the night and woke her nurse up, got out of bed, which the nurse said would have been impossible. And she said, "My mother's here. Call my children. Call my children." Well, it was 2:30 in the morning, so she didn't call us. And when I got there late the next day, I heard that story and went, "Oh my God, I'm glad we're here," because I knew that meant she was very close to passing. So to me, those are not hallucinations at all. Those are absolutely real encounters with the spiritual realm that just show us that someone is getting close to making the transition. And it's just, the dying process can be a great teacher to all of us, to those who are going through the dying process, as well as to all other souls involved in their lifetime. And that's why, paying more attention to this and the kind of sacred reverence of that setting, and how the teaching abilities of people in that dying process can be so beautiful. In fact, many, many people who came up to talk to me after I give my Proof of Heaven talk, even before the book Proof of Heaven came out, and they'd tell me a story about their own experience, often a near-death experience, sometimes a shared death, which are just like near death, but happen in perfectly healthy people, usually family members of someone who's passing over. But anyway, it was this incredible sense of love being involved there. And what these people would tell me is that the greatest gift their loved one ever gave them was something that happened at the time they were dying or afterwards, that showed that their soul was still very much connected in real time to the living soul. And that was the gift that the living soul was reporting to me, that some evidence was there, some demonstration that they were still around and still available to help, and a promise basically that they would be there when this next soul's time comes for passing over. So it's all about love. It's all about transformation and evolution. The human condition is one where we're just now coming into greater wisdom around all this. I mean, the heyday of scientific materialism in the 20th and early 21st century was certainly a heyday of kind of anti-spiritual warfare from scientists. And yet the more we've learned the deepest lesson of quantum physics, we realize it's teaching us that the best philosophical model for this world is probably one of idealism, or of what I like. My personal favorite is evolutionary panentheism. Basically, this kind of God force being within all of us, but spread out, and gives us this world with our different individual qualities. And yet we're ultimately sharing that one mind. So we're sharing the dream of the one mind. And that's what's allowing for this growth and transformation. And that's what I think ultimately this is all about, is greater wisdom about the nature of reality, our purpose for being here, our purpose for all of us being here together. I mean, we're not here to be in conflict and warfare. We're here for some bigger, higher purpose. And that is much more one that shows these beautiful lessons of kindness, compassion, and mercy. And that ultimately unconditional love gives us tremendous power to come into wholeness and healing.
So I'm really glad you bring up the one mind, because I wanted to ask you, do you believe it's, I don't want to get too speculative here, but do you believe it's one grand consciousness that, splits itself into trillions of fragments, or do you believe maybe there's, multiple souls, or do you think it's one consciousness that splits?
Yes, I think that there is one primordial mind that splits. It dissociates into these little eddy currents. The brain thus serves as a filter that allows for a little eddy current of that primordial mind to be present in our mind. We take it as ours and think that we own it and that the boundaries are concrete, but they're not. That's where telepathy, that's where near-death experiences, where people readily have access to the minds of people who have already left the physical world. They have access to minds of people still in the physical world, but maybe thousands of miles distant. And so what this is showing us is the very unusual aspect of that kind of near-death or dying state, is one where we have broad access across space and time to all the souls that are important to us. And I think that we're supposed to have this kind of skin in the game. And that's why in the kind of dark ages of materialism, There was, so much denial of the spiritual evidence and empirical facts. People would report these stories, and you would have scientists who would say that's impossible. The brain creates consciousness. Your brain was way too sick at that time to have any such experience. Therefore, it's a hallucination. But in my case, that doesn't work because I had this profound set of experiences, and all the medical data was crystal clear that my brain was in no shape to have any kind of dream or hallucination. I mean, the very fact that I survived it all is a tremendous surprise and had a full recovery. I mean, 2% survival is not a miracle, but the recovery I ended up benefiting, which none of the doctors taking care of me expected, was an absolute miraculous healing. And in fact, when that medical case report was submitted to the Journal of Nervous and Mental Diseases, the peer reviewers challenged the authors. How do you explain this unprecedented recovery Dr. Alexander had from E. coli meningoencephalitis and deep coma for a week? And they said it's because he had a near-death experience. That's what allowed for this profound healing. And they knew of other cases, as did the peer review scientific editors, like Anita Morjani, who's wrote the book Dying to Be Me, and she had an advanced stage 4 lymphoma that just disappeared when she came back from a rich spiritual experience of her NDE. Likewise, Dr. Mary C. Neal, orthopedic surgeon, who was kayaking in Chile in the late 1990s, had an over 30-minute warm water drowning where her legs were broken and she was jammed under boulders underwater, and they brought her to the surface dead. Ask any doctor what a 30-minute plus warm water drowning does to your brain. They'll say it's mush. They're not coming back. Well, she came back. She made a full recovery, went back to orthopedic surgery. And like me and like Anita, she's gone around the world sharing her story, because these stories from people who have had these miracles of healing are lessons to all of us about our spiritual nature and the way all of us can use prayer and meditation to come into deeper alignment with our reason for being here, for our purpose and meaning, and certainly to come into greater wholeness. And that includes healing and health, because those are aspects of wholeness.
It's interesting that you refer to the brain as a filter, because I think about this all the time. We see less than 1% of the light spectrum. I doubt we're hearing the whole audible spectrum. Those are just only two senses. I have a pet bird that has more cones and rods in her eyes than I do. So I constantly look around and think, what does this world really look like? But I definitely agree that the brain could be a filter. So upon, let's say, permanent death, do you believe that the filter is kind of lifted, or is it like a liberation of sorts?
Yeah, well, what happens is your awareness, which is the only thing that's ever been there anyway, is your awareness of things going on. That awareness is liberated to a much higher level. I mean, that's basically what NDEers are describing. They talk about, life reviews, life flash before your eyes. An interesting thing when you look at the scientific data on life reviews, for example, Bruce Grayson's paper in the Journal of Near-Death Studies in the fall of 2021, where he talked about almost 700 life reviews in his database of NDEs. And he basically says 74% of people experience it from the perspective of everybody involved in all of the events. So, in other words, if you've been busy handing out pain and suffering to others, in your life review, you have to be on the receiving end of that. And that might not be much fun if you've been handing out all that pain and suffering and been selfish and greedy. And that's why it gently nudges us away from those kind of narcissistic and sociopathic kinds of behavior, more towards altruism and philanthropy and caring for others. I mean, that's what more advanced souls do. After multiple passages through this world and multiple life reviews, you start living that love of others. And that's what this whole world is doing, is we're finally getting to a point where through scientific objectification and understanding, we can start to put together models of the world that makes much more sense. And they really involve this one mind, this primordial mind hypothesis that we discuss in great detail in our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, and how it's dissociated out into these little eddy currents of consciousness. But it's really all, I like, the analogy I like is like a diamond with facets. So the diamond is the one mind. The facets are the different perspectives. So each one of us offers a different perspective. And it's our interactions with each other that generates this kind of knowledge and information and understanding of that primordial mind as it grows. and comes into greater and greater understanding of itself and the universe at large through this kind of grand experiment of all of us interacting and yet being all of different facets on the diamond of that one mind. But the one mind is not this eternal state of perfection. It's in continuous evolution towards that divinity. And that's what we're witnessing in this whole process. And humans participate in this. You know, that old saying, all politics is local. Likewise, all evolution of consciousness throughout the cosmos is nothing more than individual sentient beings, taking charge, exploring their own consciousness, and coming to a deeper understanding of what they find in these grand adventures. Near death and shared death experiences are a beautiful aspect of that journey because they show much grander potential for all of us in coming to a deeper understanding of who we are and what this is all about.
It's interesting. So I had a near death experience of my own, but as far as what I saw on the other side was very brief. I'll
Uh-huh.
spare you the details because I've told the story, but it left me with more questions than answers. And I feel like, ironically enough, what gives me comfort is not only people's stories such as yourself and everything, uh, but the numbers. It sounds so silly, but like the universe clearly doesn't seem to be logical in nature once you get into quantum physics, but for some reason, the logic just gives me that comfort, right? You have 8 billion human beings on the planet. You have 2.16 million species that we found on the planet. There's trillions of organisms living on your skin. So when I think of how astronomical the numbers are, I say, I think we're going to be okay. So ironically enough, the logic helps.
Yes. Well, ultimately, I think there is a deep logic to all of it, but it kind of defies our common sense interpretations. But it's really about a unification of mind, and that this is all a process of growth. This is not a predetermined universe, which a lot of materialists still believe to be true, but one that where quantum indeterminacy is the very source of human free will, that ultimately guides the direction of evolution of all that emerges in this physical universe. I mean, all of our reality ultimately depends heavily on human free will and how it influences all of these journeys.
Maybe there could be some deterministic aspects of the hardware, which is literally the brain body neural network. But it seems as though maybe consciousness and the free will that comes along with that is the independent variable, right? I don't see it as deterministic either.
Well, yeah, and I think to make it clear what I'm talking about in terms of the influence of the will, some of the best examples from my perspective are these miraculous healing in the setting of near-death experiences. I mean, they're perfect examples of how if you just buy into all the material stuff at play, you cannot explain it. You cannot explain how that kind of healing happens. And I would say a similar argument applies to what's known as terminal lucidity or paradoxical lucidity. People who've been in deep coma, sometimes for years, will, right before they die, usually within hours or a day or two, they wake up very aware, very knowledgeable, memories intact, communicate with loved ones who might be there at the bedside before they then pass from this world. But terminal lucidity or paradoxical lucidity completely defies the bleak, paltry fiction nonsense of materialist beliefs that it's birth to death, nothing more, and that your brain creates consciousness. No, the brain is not creating it at all. And there's plenty of evidence for that in the scientific community, but we're just slowly waking up to that much richer truth. And you can see the power of will in the kind of healing that I went through. I'm 70 years old now, but and I'm 16, almost 16 years out from a deadly week-long coma from E. coli meningoencephalitis. It should have killed me, but it didn't. And I'm here to say that there's a tremendous role for our spiritual wisdom and exploration in helping to bring us into wholeness and healing.
Speaking of miraculous healings after a near-death experience, I just want to say, I know that you said 2% chance of living is not a miracle. In my book, I would say that's a miracle as far as I'm concerned, and I'm very happy that you made it through it. So, uh, you have said, and I'm going to paraphrase, that evil needs to exist because there's free will, but that there's more love than evil. My question is, we have this free will, but do you ever feel like we innately know what is right and wrong if there is a right and wrong?
Well, I think we have a very good sense of right and wrong and of love versus fear. That's essentially the choice we're making all the time in these bodies as spiritual beings, waking up to the kind of spiritual nature of the universe, is that love is the answer. And certainly from the near-death experiencer perspective, I mean, that's why so many, tens of millions of people have come back from those kind of experiences not fearing death because they realize that that realm is very loving, very accepting, a spiritual home, and that also will be headed back because of soul growth. You can't do it in one incarnation. And So that between lives is kind of, you've got the life review and reuniting with souls of departed loved ones. That kind of gives us a break. And then we dive back in for more learning and teaching in these lives. This is where we get the work done. In the material realm, we don't get the work done there. That's in the spiritual realm is just where we get the life reviews, which help us to kind of course correct and select the various challenges for the next incarnation. And then we dive back in. And then we have that program forgetting so that by the time we're 7 or 8, we don't remember all of the stuff that our higher soul is privy to, but remember that that's always available in the deep subconscious. And that's why deep meditation and centering prayer to get at some of that deeper knowledge of your higher soul can be so effective. And especially quieting the madness of the ego mind, the linguistic brain dealing with this crazy polarized world of ours. It's very nice to get a break from all that in a field of unity and love, which is what that spiritual realm offers us in prayer and meditation, a beautiful resource to help us kind of recover. But it's how we then choose to live in this world that makes all the difference. So, don't get me wrong that, I think the darkness and evil are really um, trace ingredients that are there to help provide that gradient so that we move more towards that oneness of love and compassion and kindness. And that's where I think the world is headed now. Even though you wouldn't know it from reading the headlines, everything looks so polarized and fractious and fear-based. But ultimately, there's nothing to fear but fear itself. And the fear mongers out there are using it to manipulate people. But there are many reasons why we can see that our higher soul taking charge of all this can start leading us into a much richer, more fulfilling and harmonious world than the crazy, fractious world we live in that's so dominated by fear and anxiety.
You really have to think for yourself nowadays with all the manipulation, but then you don't want to be self-deceived or arrogant. So you got to kind of walk that fine line and kind of figure it out for yourself. But yes, they're lying to us all the time. So after a near-death experience, you've now seen the other side and you're continuing to live your life in this physical body. How do you handle this? Does it make life easier for you, more comforting, or could it get distracting at times? Is it a mix of both?
I would say it was frustrating for quite a long time because it took me a long time to figure a lot of this out. It's not like you have the NDE and all of a sudden you know everything. As you put it earlier, after your NDE, you seem to have more kind of questions than answers. And I'd say that's absolutely true. I do not feel I'm close to the end of assimilating my NDE. I'm almost 16 years out. As far as I'm concerned, I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make better and better sense of it. And then, of course, I'll get that deep dive into primordial mind and then come back and try and do it even better next time. But it's all a gift. It's a tremendous gift. I know some people do struggle initially after an NDE, but I think by and large, they have very positive, powerful transformational effects in most people's lives if you really pay attention and try and assimilate the deep lessons and then start living your life that way, honoring what you've learned through that extraordinary adventure.
If you could ask one question to the person watching this video right now, what would it be?
I would probably want to ask them, why they're here, why they're on this earth, what have they come to discern in their lifetime to date that gives them a purpose and meaning in life. And if they don't have a strong answer to that one, how do they make sense of that kind of question, or do they think that life is not meant to necessarily be worthwhile or have a purpose. But I'd like to quiz people kind of on where they are on that spectrum of understanding of their own reason for existence.
That is a fantastic question. And I think that kind of plays into what you said about that we're kind of on our own personal journeys. Like when it comes to purpose, right? My life's purpose is different from my neighbor's, right? I've been skateboarding for 25 years. I've dedicated my whole life to it. This person doesn't care about skateboarding at all, right? So I think we are on personal journeys, and I think purpose, would you agree with the following? Do you think the purpose of life is up to the individual?
Well, I say it in a more general fashion. I often refer people to the inscription at the entrance to the temple of Apollo in Delphi in Greece. And that inscription is know thyself. And I believe very much that's what living is all about, is know thyself, coming to a much deeper understanding of who this thing I call self is. But especially acknowledging, as I do, the oneness of mind and that connection with basically the mind of the universe. That's really a deep question about the nature of reality that hits on all cylinders. What's your meaning, your purpose? What are you doing right now, and how are you furthering your meaning and purpose? And how do you express yourself? And how is it that when you do come to the very end of life uh, in this body, what is it that you look at and can assess as whether or not you've been successful at existing here, or is that a meaningless question? I'd like to know all of that. But I think it's really to know thyself, and that is a really deep question about the universe at large when you acknowledge this kind of primordial mind hypothesis, as we do in Living in a Mindful Universe.
Well, it certainly does seem to have a lot of meaning, and I think the ripple effect of not only your experience, but your willingness to share with others, I think you're doing an incredible job for a lot of people, maybe even more than you know. I think what you do sincerely helps a lot of people, including myself. So thank you very
Well,
much for that.
hey,
So
Dave.
before we sign off, do you mind telling people where they could find you, where they can find your books, etc.?
Right. If they go to Eben, Alexander.com, there's a lot of information there on all the books. There's a recommended reading list with more than 100 recommendations, often with hot links to scientific papers. There's an FAQ page. It's very important for people to get the bigger picture of my journey and some of the criticisms that have been directed at me, et cetera. So the FAQ page, and also lists of many interviews, conferences, et cetera. So all that at ebenalexander.com. I recommend sacredacoustics.com for anyone who wants to get into profound differential frequency brainwave entrainment meditation techniques. And then, of course, one other website, innersanctumcenter.com. That's INNER sanctumcenter.com. And that's one that Karen and I have several options there. There's a whole series of free interviews we did for more than 2 years, every 2 weeks during the pandemic, with thought leaders around the world and other experiencers on consciousness. Also, there's a mental health practitioner course available there that we made with Dr. Anna Yusum. She wrote that paper in the Journal of Nervous and Mental Disease, supporting sacred acoustics as a tremendously powerful tool in alleviating anxiety, 26% reduction over 2 weeks in her study. But that mental health practitioner course is there at innersanctumcenter.com. And there's also a monthly webinar that we do that's available at that same innersanctumcenter.com. So I hope people will keep in touch with me through those websites.
Dr. Eben Alexander, thank you so much for coming on. It's been an absolute pleasure. And you have an incredible story. You're doing an incredible job. And to everyone watching at home, thank you so much for your sliver of time. This has been ours. Eben, thanks again.
Well, thank you, Dave. It's been great talking with you, and I appreciate what you do getting this out to the world.
I try my best. All right. Well, peace out, everyone. All right. I'm usually not this disorganized, but I knew I was forgetting the book. I would really love to just kind of give you like the
Oh, I'm
shout
glad you
out with
have
it.
them.
So
Excellent.
I have two of them. I should have got all three, but I got two.
Not the two most important ones. Those are really my story. The map of heaven, just makes the point that these things happen to all kinds of people by the tens of millions. So it's not a rare occurrence, but those two contain my personal story. That's what you need.
Yeah, yeah, I got the Proof of Heaven and the Living in a Mindful Universe.
Right.
Which order did they come out? Was it Proof of
Proof
Heaven
of
and then
heaven was
Map?
first. Proof of heaven, then map, and then living in a mindful universe.
Nice, nice. Okay, cool. I'm actually a little bit speechless on that one. So but yeah, those man, you're a good speaker, man. You know, you're very like genuine. Oh, I couldn't hear what you said, but
So I just said I'm trying to make sense of it. I mean, I went through this extraordinary experience, and I there's no way I came back here just to ignore it. I came back here to explain it, make sense of it, and I think there's some deep and profound lessons in there for all of us that can be very helpful in living these lives, especially in these challenging times.